More than a few people have asked me my views on climate change, and I've been hesitant to give them. First off, because I haven't read that much of the scientific literature, and because most of the debate around climate change seems to be dominated by politics more than science. Either you're an evil climate change denier, or you're a gullible alarmist. So I fully expect that once I hit publish on this video and the comments come rolling in, I'll probably regret having made it. But let's press on into the void anyway. So I've been trying to get up to speed on climate change and realise that I don't fit into either the denier or alarmist category. I'm both a skeptic and a believer at the same time, and it wasn't until I read an article in early June by a self-confessed conservative in the not-so-conservative New York Times that I realised what I was. Turns out I'm a lukewarmer. So what's a lukewarmer? Well, according to the article, lukewarmers accept that the Earth is warming and that our civilization's ample CO2 emissions are a major cause. They doubt, however, that climate change represents a crisis unique among the varied challenges we face, or that the global regulatory schemes advanced to deal with it will work as advertised. And they raise an eyebrow at the contrast between the apocalyptic absolutist rhetoric with which these schemes are regularly defended and their actual details, which seem mostly designed to enable the globe's statesmen to greenwash the pursuit of economic and political self-interest. And that about sums it up for me, especially that last part, as here in Australia there is bipartisan support for the totally ineffectual Paris Treaty and a ridiculous renewable energy target which by our government's own admission will do nothing to affect global temperatures. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time explaining why carbon dioxide causes global warming, because if you think it's all a hoax cooked up by the IPCC or a scheme to make Al Gore rich, then I doubt I'm going to convince you otherwise. But it really just comes down to some basic science that you learn in high school called the greenhouse effect, and you don't need the IPCC or fancy computer models to prove it. And for this segment, I'm going to get an excellent YouTuber on this topic called Potholer54 to do the heavy lifting.
What's the evidence that CO2 can cause global warming? In other words, the theory behind it all. I covered this in more detail in the first video of this series, so I'm going to keep it simple. It was way back in the 19th century that physicists discovered that carbon dioxide lets through short wavelength light, the kind that passes through our atmosphere, but traps longer wavelength heat radiation of the kind that would be reflected back into space. This experiment was done and can still be done in a laboratory. In 1896, Svante Arrhenius calculated that based on this simple principle of physics, higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere would therefore block more outgoing radiation, and that would raise global temperatures. In the 1930s, Guy Stewart Callendar showed that the radiation absorbed by CO2 was at different wavelengths to the radiation absorbed by another important greenhouse gas, water vapor. By the 1950s and 60s, rising CO2 levels suggested that a much warmer world would soon be inevitable. Climatologists not only know that CO2 blocks outgoing heat through experiment, but they can also measure exactly how much. That's how they know that a doubling of CO2 from pre-industrial levels will lead to a rise in average global temperatures of about 1 degree centigrade. And all climate scientists accept the fact that water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. Again, this is basic physics, shown by experiment and measurable. The difference between water vapor and carbon dioxide is that when you put water vapor into the atmosphere, it doesn't stay there very long. The atmosphere can only hold so much water vapor at a given temperature, and any excess condenses and falls to the ground. Even if you manage to turn all the Earth's lakes and rivers into water vapor in a single day, it would simply condense and come crashing back to Earth. The only way to get the atmosphere to hold more water vapor is to warm it up, and that's what carbon dioxide does. When CO2 is put into the air, it doesn't fall straight back down again. About half of it dissolves in water and half stays in the atmosphere. It accumulates. That's why CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have been steadily rising since the start of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. So CO2 warms the atmosphere, and a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, which increases temperatures further. The basic laws of physics tell us that the Earth will heat up in response to this extra energy, and the temperature will keep rising until the increased amount of energy radiated out matches the amount coming in, what's called equilibrium. the temperature will eventually stabilize at a higher level. What will that higher level be? Well, you can estimate it with computer models, sure, but you can also do it through other methods, including looking back at the effect CO2 had in the past. And these estimates show that for a doubling of CO2 concentrations, we should see a rise in global temperatures of between 2 and 4.5 degrees. Now that's all basic physics, but to see if this happens in practice, we need to go back over the geological record and answer the second question: what's the evidence CO2 has had an impact on global temperatures in the past? If basic physics is correct, then we should see a good correlation between temperatures and CO2 over the past 500 million years. Well, here's the data for temperatures, and here's the data for CO2 levels. Put them together, and you get a very clear... oh dear. Actually, no one expected to see a correlation between the two because, of course, we're missing the most important factor of them all, the sun.
Well, they virtually ignore the sun as a factor of climate change. Everybody knows that the sun is the main source of energy, and it's only got a flicker and it has an effect on us.
Tim Ball thinks he's talking about researchers here, but it's the climate science critics, the politicians, the bloggers, and the amateurs who showcase this graph that completely ignores the role of the sun, and it's the climate researchers who factor it in. Over the last 500 million years, solar output has been getting gradually stronger. Of course, on its own, it doesn't show any better correlation with global temperatures than carbon dioxide does on its own. But if the CO2 temperature link is correct, then when we factor in both CO2 and solar irradiance, which are the long-term drivers of climate, then we should get a very good correlation with global temperatures, and we do. And a third piece of evidence from our geological past are the so-called snowball Earth conditions. Since the sun was much weaker than today during the Precambrian period, the cooled Earth should have been almost entirely covered in ice, and it was several times. So what thawed it out? The only thing that changed during the snowball period was that CO2 levels rose dramatically through volcanic activity. The thawing of the planet fits perfectly with carbon dioxide's role as a powerful greenhouse gas. Over time, CO2 tends to get washed out of the atmosphere due to chemical weathering, becoming carbonates that fall to the sea floor and turn into carbonate rocks. But during snowball Earth, for obvious reasons, that kind of weathering didn't happen, which is why CO2 would have accumulated in the atmosphere. And since those high levels of CO2 remained even after the Earth had thawed, the Earth kept warming until it became a hothouse, with coral reefs close to the poles. Yes, even with the sun about 6% weaker than it is today, but with carbon dioxide levels 25 times higher, the Earth was much hotter than today. This anomaly is our fourth piece of evidence that carbon dioxide is a powerful greenhouse gas. Over millions of years, carbon dioxide weathered out of the atmosphere, and as levels dropped, so did the temperature. The Earth became a snowball once again, and the process repeated itself. Carbon dioxide's role in regulating past temperature is so clear that CO2 has been called the Earth's thermostat. So when I hear the argument, the climate's always changed, and this is perfectly natural, and that the climate change going on now is perfectly natural, well, of course it is. There's absolutely no difference between the CO2 that's being added to the atmosphere now and the CO2 that was added to the atmosphere in the past. It's the same stuff, and its warming effect on the atmosphere is exactly the same.
And if you want to know more about climate change, I suggest you check out Potholer 54's channel. It is a wealth of information on the topic. And now to the skepticism. But first, a diversion. Now, I don't know anything about climate science or weather prediction, but I do know something about economics and economic forecasting. And basically, it's this. Whenever you see an economist on TV giving forecasts, hit the mute button. They are of absolutely no use. And this is not hyperbole. I truly mean that. Economists are great at telling you what happened in the past, but the moment they start talking about the future, tune out. In fact, about 10 years after I finished my undergrad in accounting economics, I read this in John Ralston Saul's Unconscious Civilization, and it rang true. Economics as a prescriptive science is actually a minor area of speculative investigation. Econometrics, this statistical, narrow, unthinking lower form of economics, is passive tinkering, less reliable and less useful than car mechanics. The only part of this domain which has some reliability is economic history, and it's being downgraded in most universities, even eliminated, because tied as it is to events, it is an unfortunate reminder of reality. Over the last quarter century, economics has raised itself to the level of a scientific profession and more or less foisted a Nobel Prize in its own honour onto the Nobel Committee, thanks to an annual financing from a bank. Yet over the same 25 years, economics has been spectacularly unsuccessful in its attempts to apply its models and theories to the reality of our civilization. It's not that the economist's advice hasn't been taken, it has, in great detail, with great reverence, and in general, it has failed. And there's plenty of empirical evidence to back that up. Anyway, what's the point of this diversion? Well, it's to say that we humans are not very good at forecasting complex systems like the economy. And so too are the models to predict climate change extremely complex. And so armed with my experience of economics, I'm completely unsurprised at the failed predictions of climate models. So let's go back and look at the seminal presentation by James Hansen to Congress back in 1988. And if you're wondering why this graphic is shitty, well, it was the 80s. Basically, Hansen's models were a good fit with history up to that point in time, and then he projected 3 scenarios based on future growth or declines in emissions. So you can see scenario A was predicting a 1.5 degree rise over a 50-year period, or a little over 3 degrees over a century. And scenario B, about 2.8 degrees over a century. Actual emissions were somewhere in between A and B. So how did the predictions do? Well, they were way out. Surface temperatures were about half of that predicted, and satellite about a third of what Hansen had predicted. But let's go with more up-to-date IPCC forecasts from the 5th IPCC assessment report. You can see the forecast ranges for each of the IPCC's assessments in colour. The grey area represents the error band, and the black dots are actual global temperatures. And so you can see that temperatures have basically fallen out of the lowest prediction bands. So obviously temperatures have been rising at a much slower rate than was expected. Now I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to go into why the predictions failed, the overestimation of forcing, or any of the other theories. I don't actually care why they failed. Feel free to speculate all you like in the comments. This is just meant to be a first pass at this topic. The main point I wanted to hammer home here is that while I buy the science of how warming occurs, the alarmist predictions have just not played out, primarily because I don't believe climate scientists can predict such a complex system like the climate with any precision. And that, my friends, is why I am a proud Lukewarmer. So, are you a denialist, an alarmist, a Lukewarmer, or something else altogether? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.